My soul's in great adventure jail. My body and soul's in great adventure jail. I'm trapped here in mono-mapped in here, hand clapped in great adventure jail. Joey's in great adventure jail.
I had a teacher whose name was Raymond Ludicky. And at one point, he probably saved my life by just saying to me, I don't know what to do with you. I don't know what this is. I don't know. He would say something like, if you are going to repeat a phrase, it better be a very, very interesting phrase. You know, if you're studying with a guy who studied with George Crumb, there's obviously something to do with the complexity of how the music looks on the paper. That's a very important thing. And so when you see, I think, maybe the first Steve Reich score I saw in Source magazine might have been like Pieces of Wood or something like that. And you look at it, and this has plagued me to this day with my own music when I show it to musicians, because you look at it and it doesn't look all that startling. And in fact, the violinist or somebody will play and it'll be great. And then when you put it together, it's a much harder thing, because metric things are crossing over into different things. And so what was interesting about discovering that first Reich score was it's not the way the music looks, it's what the result of these two lines are that turns into something. So for a huge light went off in my head in terms of thinking, well, first of all, I'm obviously not alone out in the world. There's something going on that at least in Kansas City isn't getting a lot of exposure, but I now know it exists. I became very interested in a harmonic approach through rhythm. So now the minimalists are already kind of doing that. They've already kind of turned this thing on its head and said, instead of it being melody, harmony, and rhythm, which has been the tradition for European Western music, we're going to kind of flip that and say rhythm's the most important, harmony is next, and in fact melody is kind of a result of these two things happening together. Okay, well and good, and I like a lot of that music, but I thought there's something more that could go on here. And as I started experimenting with using rhythmic permutations as cadence points, I started to realize, and you can really see this in Dennis Cleveland, things like Soul Train, I could get away with different kinds of harmonies having the effect of resolution that you'd normally get in tonal harmony, but they could be completely unrelated in keys, simply because the mind will start to feel this cycle spreading apart and coming together, and as they come together there's a natural resolve. And that to me was the most exciting part, was to take the influence of minimalism, to take my love of rock and roll, but actually come up with something that wouldn't just be about a lot of layers and a lot of contrapuntal stuff happening, but would actually have a structure and a purpose, so that very, very important points within the piece, whether it's a 3 to 5 minute pop song or whether it's a 17-minute choral thing like Soul Train and Dennis Cleveland, you'd have this convergence, this rhythmic convergence that was sort of creating a new way of thinking of harmony. And that was when you're asking what was I thinking, that was it. We have digital now. We can do so many things with the flick of a button, but I actually have graphs that are going to be in the NYPL show at Lincoln Center of these 18 pages of periodicity charts that I did by hand. I mean, they're insane. You look at them and you think, this is an insane person. But that was the only way I could make a chart like that, was to have it. And then stripping that down and getting used to what each one, just like sort of like, when you're at a conservatory, you do ear training. but you don't really do rhythmic ear training as much as you do, you know, harmony and pitch. And so I started to get really good at training, you know, what 3 against 5 sounded like, and then 3 against 6. And think of Charles Ives when he used to, you know, have his kids sing in one key and he'd play another. That's a brilliant ear training. And so the same thing was happening for me with rhythm, as I wanted to get to know how these rhythms worked together so that it would become a vocabulary, so that I could sort of do it completely intuitively, but understand, you know, how a 3 will go against a 5 or go against a 7. And then you start to add those together and you add more. So it was never density for density's sake, but it was a real interest in how much could you get into this with it while it's still being clear. And again, that clarity coming from growing up with the recording of popular music and how wonderfully dense that, you know, that could be.
What's going on with you guys? They cut you 1 hour a week?
Are you sure?
Very sure?
Very sure.
Pressure point.
Pressure point.
The gig isn't to sound like, oh, look, isn't this complex? Aren't I clever? I mean, the gig is to make good music. But what I always liked about what I did and the music that I was influenced by was you could dig deeper and deeper. If you don't want to, that's fine, but it rewards repeated listening. And all the music that has attracted me, I could always find ways into it on 2 or 3 levels. Yeah, and I don't care what you call it. You could call it structured pop music, or you could call it something else, but it was that moment where I was transitioning, and also understanding that I really respond to the sound of music that comes from the rock and jazz world, and I respond to the structure of classical music. And I think what a lot of people did in the 80s and certainly in the 90s were they sort of decided to rock out a little bit. So it's the rocking out string quartet and the rocking out classical ensemble. But for me, that wasn't as interesting as the structure of the music. And I think that's been very confusing for people. In fact, sometimes I think people have sort of blamed me for doing my job too well, because a lot of the records sound like bona fide pop and rock records. But if you strip down what's actually happening in the music, it's quite complex and it's quite interesting. You know, I'm 53 years old and I still don't really fit in any genre. And it kind of cuts you out of a lot of things in both worlds. But at the same time, I'm happy with the work I'm making. I'm happy with what I'm doing. And so what are you going to do? You're kind of stuck with making a choice that you really feel strongly about.
The mark of the true believer, unbuttoned and paraphrased to death, is the vapid look, the right between the eyes, the conformity that passes for individualism. It is the most widely exercised form of cross-breeding known to man. The animus tuatusi, the recovered memory.